Okay, good evening, everybody. I think we'll make a start. Welcome to the Stepping Stones webinar on the historic landscape of the Stepping Stones area. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Charlie Bell. I'm the Stepping Stones project officer. I also need to introduce Janine Young, who I'll be handing over to in just a few minutes. Janine's a local archaeologist and she'll be giving the talk this evening. So just a little bit of Zoom housekeeping before I hand over to Janine. The first thing to say is that I am recording this webinar this evening. I'll be uploading it to the Stepping Stones YouTube channel in a few days, and then I'll share the link with all of you and with anyone else who's interested in watching it as well. So just bear in mind, it is being recorded. If you don't want to appear on the recording, the easiest thing to do is just to turn your video off. If you're not familiar with Zoom before, you should be able to see a little menu bar at the bottom of your screen, and towards the left of that there's a button that says stop video. It's actually quite a good idea to do that anyway, so I will advise everybody to do that anyway. It seems to save on bandwidth, and I know Janine's presentation has got some lovely big photographs and maps and things in that are quite large files, so it might just help if everybody turns their screens off. I have muted everybody, that was the default when you join the meeting, and I have muted anyone who's unmuted themselves, so apologies for that, but it just seems to be the easiest way to avoid any background noise during the meeting. If you haven't used Zoom much before, there are various different options about how you view the screen. So for an evening talk like this, probably the best option is to change it to speaker view. Now, if you haven't done that before, if you hover over the top right of your Zoom screen, hopefully at some point a little button will pop up that says view. If you click that, there should be various different options: gallery view, full screen view, and one of those is speaker view. So probably makes the most sense to select that for this evening. Then you'll always be sure to see Janine when she's speaking. Okay, so Janine will give her talk for around about an hour or maybe just less than an hour. There'll then be some opportunities for questions. And given the fact there's so many of us on this call tonight, which is brilliant, over 50 people, which is fantastic, I think the easiest way is for probably you to funnel those questions through me rather than it being a free-for-all. So there's a couple of ways you can do that. There is a chat function in Zoom. Again, if you hover your mouse towards the bottom of the screen, there should be a little speech bubble that says chat. You can type your questions in there, and then I can read those out to Janine. The other way, if you prefer to ask the question directly yourself, is to raise your hand on Zoom. So you can do that digitally, and the way to do that is to, again, on the bottom of your screen, you should see a button called Participants. That'll show you a list of everybody who's on the call. If you find yourself on that list, there is an option within that to raise your hand. If you just kind of hover over yourself, an option should come up to raise your hand. And again, I'll keep an eye on that at the end during the questions, and ask those questions to Janine, or invite yourself to unmute and ask the question yourself. Okay, so before I hand over to Janine, just a little bit of background about the Stepping Stones project and about why we've got this talk tonight. For those of you who aren't familiar with the project, Stepping Stones is a landscape scale nature conservation project covering over 200 square kilometres of within the South Shropshire area of outstanding natural beauty. Now, it is primarily a nature conservation project about creating and linking wildlife-friendly habitat, but of course also encompassing working closely with people and also thinking about the historic environment. It's all very much part of the same thing. Everything is interlinked. As you'll hear, the area is extremely rich in archaeology and rich in history. And the land use of the area throughout history has really given shape to the landscape and has influenced both the habitats and the wildlife that we're all familiar with today. So we're trying to be very mindful of the history of the area when we're undertaking our nature conservation work. This year, we're lucky enough to be funded by a grant called the Green Recovery Challenge Fund, which is administered by the Heritage Lottery. And under this grant, we've commissioned Janine to complete a report into the historic landscape of the Stepping Stones area. So it's really the findings of this report that form the basis of Janine's talk tonight. If you want to find out more about the project, you can look us up online. If you search for Stepping Stones Project or National Trust Stepping Stones Project, that'll come up. We are a partnership project, many different organisations involved, but currently led by the National Trust. So you'll find us on the National Trust website. The best way to keep in touch with the project, however, is to sign up to the Stepping Stones newsletter. I know many of you already are, and that's how you found out about the webinar this evening. If you're not signed up to that, you can either drop me an email, ask to be added to the list, or I'll circulate a link where you can sign yourselves up to. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to Janine.
Thanks, Charlie, and great to see everybody. Thanks so much for all coming along. It's great to see so many little boxes on the screen, which means there's lots of people here. I'm just bringing up my my slides. Charlie, can you just give me a nod when you can see that, so I know when?
Yeah, I can see that, Janine.
Everybody's in. Okay, brilliant. Okay, so yeah, as Charlie has said, this evening is all about having a look at the historic environment or the historic landscape of the Stepping Stones area. And I thought it'd be interesting to just have a little think about what that is before we sort of get really stuck in. So the historic environment is everything, really. It's all aspects of the environment which result from the interaction between people and places through time. So what we're really looking at here is all the physical remains of human activity, of human history, whether you can see it, whether you can't see it, whether that's buried archaeology, whether it's buildings in the landscape. And these are just a couple of little examples of the type of things that we mean when we talk about the historic environment. And I sort of flag this up really because I suppose a lot of people think about perhaps just archaeology or buried archaeological remains. But what we're really thinking about here is the landscape as a whole and all those different things within the landscape that combine together to make the historic environment. And like Charlie said, I think the impact of the human intervention on the landscape, on this particular landscape, over literally thousands and thousands of years, has been really significant, and each separate period has left its own sort of little scars and marks on the landscape. And it's really important to think about when we're thinking about what we want this landscape to look like today. So if we are looking at projects like the Stepping Stones is, focusing on wildlife and sort of building connectivity for wildlife, it's really important to have a look at what's gone before, really, and to look at what clues we can pick up from the landscape that might give us an idea of how we want to move forward in the future and what we might want it to look like in the future. So I'm just going to whistle through, really, period by period. I'm going to start at the beginning and I'm going to take you through at breakneck speed from the Neolithic period right up to the present day. It's a really, really big landscape. It's a big area that we're looking at. And there's so much. It's absolutely chock full of historic features, of landscape remains. And actually, there's no way that I'm going to be able to do any of it, any justice in any great detail. So this is a whistle-stop tour, and hopefully what it's going to do is sort of pique a little bit of interest in people. And there's so many detailed little stories and bits of information that we can pull out about different aspects of the landscape and different areas within the landscape. So this is the area that we're looking at for the Stepping Stones, and it is a huge area. Like Charlie said, I think it's something like 200 square meters. And I think I just wanted to flag up as well that I'm also involved in working on another project in the area. So we've got the Stepping Stones project, and running sort of alongside that project at the same time is a project called Our Upland Commons, which some of you may have come across as well. And that that project is looking very specifically at the upland commons in the area, but we have been looking into the historic environment for that project as well. And that takes in primarily this area of the Long Mynd here and the area of the Stuyper Stones here. They do areas of upland commons within the site area, stepping stones. So I'm sort of covering both, and there's been lots of activities around the historic environment, lots of volunteering opportunities coming up over the next couple of years for both projects, and they're so closely linked because we really are looking at the same land and the same history, that I really would, if you're interested in that kind of thing, then do look out for volunteering activities for either of the two projects, to be honest, because we're going to be doing some investigation in different areas over the next couple of years. So yeah, this is the landscape that we're looking at. It's characterised, like I say, by these areas of common land, by these hill ridges at the Long Mynd, at Stuyper Stones, across to Stapley Hill, and then across to Stretton Hills, and we're encompassing areas of down by Caradoc and the Lawley as well. So it really is a giant landscape that we're looking at, it's a really beautiful landscape, and really contains lots and lots of history. It's abundant in history, and I just came across this really lovely little quote when I started looking into doing some research on the landscape. And I wouldn't normally, but I think I'm just going to read it out because I think it was written in 1856, and it's from a piece in the London Illustrated News, written by a chap, and I'm not quite sure who he was, but he came up to make a visit to the Reverend Moore, who lived at Linley Hall, and he was interested in antiquity and archaeology, and he travelled around the area, visiting the lead mines at Shelf particularly, and he describes it as hills in abundance, rich valleys, picturesque dells and mountain gorges, covered with wood and well supplied with water. It presents a succession of scenery which changes at every step we take, and which is filled with ruins and remains of antiquity belonging to all periods. For these regions appear to have been almost better known in the earlier ages of our country than at present. And I just thought that was a really lovely sort of description of someone's perception of the landscape from, sort of over 170 years ago. Even then it was seen as this landscape already full of antiquity and interest from an historical point of view. So what I have been doing is gathering together all the data. So this is going to be a little bit data heavy, this talk, really. I've been trying to collate all the information, all the mapping information and imagery that we've got on this landscape, just to try and understand really where the significant areas are, which periods are important, where are the remains, can I pick out any patterns as to where the remains are for different time periods and things. So like I say, I'm looking at the big picture here, really, not the little detail, but what I've done hopefully is sort of drawn together all this data so that when we move forward and start looking at the little picture in little areas, we've got all that information to present a sort of really rich sort of coloured picture of what's gone on here. So I'm going to start with the Neolithic period. I'm going to start at the beginning of the knowledge of human activity in the area, and we could go back even earlier, to be honest, in this landscape. We could start looking at the geological formations and all the fascinating geological history of the area, but that's for another night perhaps and another talk. But I'm going to start with the earliest evidence we've got of human activity within the landscape, and there are little hints of activity from before the Neolithic period, in the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic, when people were living in hunter-gatherer communities. We get sort of hints of stone tools that are found here and there, but nothing kind of indicating any settlement of any significance that has ever been identified within the area. So really, the best place to start is the Neolithic period, and that's when people start settling and farming in this country, really. And it's not a very good image you've got here. I've got here really. I'll move on from this actually, but there's not a lot of Neolithic activity in the landscape, to be honest, and almost all of it we have is centred over in Stapley Common, Stapley Hill. I'm sure many of you are aware of the stone circles that are over at Mitchell's Fold and at the Hoarstones, and they really are the earliest evidence we've got for this landscape, and they're really important features. To be honest, they're quite unique within Shropshire. We don't have an abundance of stone circles, and they're also quite unique within this landscape. The other nearby features like this tend to be within lower lying areas, so they're quite unique in these upland areas, and we've got these two significant stone circles, and you might not be able to make it out, I'm sorry. And what I'm going to do after this talk, actually, just to explain, I've got all this data here, and I'm going to try and switch onto the actual data itself so I can zoom in and out and make these things clearer for you, because it's really difficult to kind of present an overview. So if my computer holds up, I'll switch to that once I've sort of done this quick whistle stop tour through. So we've got all these features over at Stapley Common, and we've got these two standing stone circles, and what are they? What are they for? We don't really know. We know that they are of significant ritual importance, and they were probably used for ceremonies, perhaps to mark calendar rites, perhaps to bury the dead. And there's all sorts of evidence from different stone circles around the country about what these were being used for, and what their purpose was. And we don't really know. And this is just an image actually taken from that article that I just quoted earlier, this nice sort of image of the Hoarstones from the article from 1856, and then some images of Mitchell's Fold. I just put this little image here of some flowers that had been left when I went up to the standing stone circle at Mitchell's Fold, probably a month or a couple of weeks ago now, and I thought it's really interesting to think about the significance of these features through time and how important they were to the Neolithic peoples, but they also have this significance today. We get people using these stone circles as points of reference, really, and as special places, and places where people still go, maybe to mark special occasions. And I think it was a really nice kind of reflection on kind of their importance of these sites within the landscape. So, from an archaeological point of view, they're considered really important. Stone circles are of national significance, but actually their significance is wider than that, because they're locally important as well. And I'm sure, many of the people on the call have been for walks across Stapley Common and looked at the stone circles. And just to flash back to the previous slide, that whole landscape is full of earthwork ridges and linear features, cultivation features. So the whole landscape, we know, was being used in the Neolithic period and into the early Bronze Age as well. And we've got evidence of barrows. You might just be able to make them out here. And we'll look at this in more detail later. And the evidence of ridges, which does suggest that some farming and some cultivation was going on as well. So these weren't just sites of ritual importance. They were perhaps sites where agriculture was being undertaken as well. I'm going to move on because I'm still in the Neolithic period, but moving into the Bronze Age, which, I'm categorising these, and the periods don't sort of come to an end abruptly, and then we switch into the Bronze Age and everything changes. So there's many overlaps, and I think those activity carried on over on Stapley Hill right into the Bronze Age. But once we get into the Bronze Age, we start to see in this landscape a sort of wealth of activity, really, and it starts to get really interesting. The landscape is one of sort of great ritual significance, I think. And this image here, I'm sort of focusing on certain features survive really well from the Bronze Age more than others. And we have certain things that survive and certain things that don't. And actually what survives from these really early periods tends to be these sites of ritual or sort of ceremonial importance. And what we have much less of is evidence of where the people were living and what the landscape looked like as a whole during the period. But we do have these kind of really intriguing remains. And in the Bronze Age, we start to see round barrows, which are essentially, have I got another slide here, are essentially earthen mounds, and they're sites of ritual significance. They sort of used to always be interpreted as burial mounds, but I think the understanding now is that they're much more than just burial mounds. They are almost, I think I read something that described it more like a parish church. It's like somewhere where there's an association where people might have gone back to on repeated occasions to bury their dead, to communicate with their ancestors. And I've just put in this this interpretation, this drawing that's been done, that it is just someone's interpretation of what might have happened. But I like the landscape in the background because I think you can see all these round barrows. And what you have, if I go back to the previous slide, and this part focuses on the Long Mynd particularly, because you find them a lot on the high ground. There are 31 of these barrows, all of which are scheduled, which means they've been recognised as of national significance. And there are 31 of them across the Long Mynd, and they tend to be, they're of earthen construction. So they're responding to the geology as well. So we have all these significant barrows scattered across the Long Mynd, but a little bit further to the west, across the Stiper Stones, just as significant during the period. But we see these prehistoric burial cairns, which is the same principle really, but they're built out of stone, so they look different in the landscape to the Bronze Age barrows. But again, it's the same principle. They are burial ceremonial features, and they're focused on the high ground. People want them to be seen. They are placed prominently in places where they can be visible. And this image I've put up on the left here. I was just trying to highlight that really. So that what you can see here is picked out in brown are the historic routes across the Long Mynd. You've got the Portway going right across the top, and then you've got the routes that run up the side of the Mynd to join the Portway. And if you look at the orange dots, which are the barrows, the locations of the barrows, it's really interesting that they seem to focus along the routeways. So these it says two really interesting things, I think. The first one is that these routeways across the Long Mynd that we all use today, as some of them as the main, our main routes across the Mynd, have been there since before the Bronze Age. They are literally thousands and thousands of years old, and these trackways have been used continuously since this early time. And what was happening in the Bronze Age is that these barrows were being built in prominent positions to be viewed, I assume, by people that are using the routeways, which I think is a really interesting sort of phenomenon, really, in terms of what people's perceptions of the importance of these features are. So that's a really interesting, and maybe it looked a little bit like this. There are enough of them, perhaps not so close together, and they are a bit more spread out, and they're not so prominent in the landscape today after thousands of years has passed since they were first constructed. But what we also see in the Bronze Age, as I said earlier, we don't have much evidence of where people were living, and very little evidence of agriculture. It's quite hard to visualize what a landscape will have looked like in that period, other than knowing that the hilltops were significant. We've got activity in Stapeley Hill, we've got activity in the Stiper Stones, across on the Long Mynd, and further across, possible hints of activity on the Lawlin, Caradoc as well in the period. So where were the people living? And why don't we find evidence of where they were living? And it's a really interesting question. The other feature that we do have that survives from this period are something we call cross dikes, which are boundary banks, essentially. And I don't know if you can see in this image again on the left, you've got a little feature here, sort of going north-south. And this is Devil's Mouth cross dike. And these are linear banks, which we have investigated some of them, and they have been dated to the Bronze Age. So we know that these boundary banks have been there across the Longmynd for several thousand of years, and they're found in a number of places across the landscape. There's one at Stitt, there's a number across Stapeley Hill, and they're really interesting kind of linear features that, again, we don't really know exactly what they were for, but we think they were probably, were they being used to mark territory or to manage stock, or to mark out for defence? They're not really substantial enough for defence. And the reason I've put this image up though is that they do seem to control these sort of narrow spurs of land, and this LiDAR data that we've recently obtained really helps visualise sort of what their purpose might be in the landscape. But again, we have a good understanding of what the landscape was like, because we know there was a focus on the uplands, but we still don't know, and maybe there are lots of things out there in the valleys and in the farmed lowlands still to discover, and maybe there's lots of features out there. There must have been people actively using the landscape in this period. So moving on from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age, and again, I'm using the terms very loosely. Much of what I'm going to talk about in the Iron Age is a continuation of activity from the later Bronze Age, really. But we do get another feature coming to the fore in this period, which is common all across Shropshire, and Shropshire has a particularly dense concentration of hill forts. And there's something like over 50 Iron Age hill forts within Shropshire alone, and 11 of those fall within the area of the stepping stones, and they're all really different. And again, it's quite hard to understand exactly what their purpose was, and they vary in size. Some of them are different shapes, some have one ditch and bank around the outside, some have two, some appear to be sort of great defensive features, and some seem like very simple hilltop enclosures. The ones I've portrayed, I've got on the left here, this is Earl's Hill, and you can see the enclosure around the top of the hill, and then this sort of long, they call it an annex, the long additional enclosure, which also follows the ridge. And you can see quite clearly the bank and ditch that goes around the outside. And then this is what is sometimes referred to as a satellite hill fort at the base of the hill, at Ponsford Hill. You can see the quite different shape. It's still an enclosure. It's still something that encloses the hilltop. But it's different in kind of in formation, really. So again, what were they being used for? There's not much work being done on the hill forts in the area or in Shropshire as a whole, really, and a bit more work has been done recently, and there's been some excavations over at Nestcliff, and a bit more work has been done at other hill forts within the region, but it's still quite difficult to tease out exactly what they were for. There was this tradition that they were always understood to be sort of big defensive features on the top of on the top of hilltops. But actually, perhaps they were used for stock control. Perhaps they were quite different. They were economic centres, and it was somewhere where grain or crops were gathered in and redistributed. And I think our understanding, there's lots more to still understand about these features, and there's lots to look at. And the more we start to kind of gather even just these remote images from things like the LiDAR data, we can start to kind of understand what they were perhaps for. And I've just put this slide in to show you sort of how where they're found within the site area, really. So you've got the Lawley and Caradoc, and I'm sure these are all places that people are really familiar with and walk to. And I'm sure that you all understand that often when you stand at the top of Caradoc, you can see all these other hill forts. You can see the Wrekin as well over to the north, and you can look across and you can see Bodbury Ring, and you can there's a lot of intervisibility there going on as well. So it's really interesting to think about what their connections were, how they related to each other, were they contemporary even. I mean, they span over a long time period. And I think really it's also really interesting in this period, in all the periods really, to think about what was going on everywhere else. Where are the people living? Where are they settling? We have very little evidence of that, to be honest. That's a lot of hill forts within the area, so that signifies quite a lot of population. Were they living within the forts themselves, or were they in the landscape? And this is just a reconstruction, and it's actually one from it's not from this area, it's actually a drawing that we had done at a site at Kimber Edge, actually, I think it is. It's an artist's impression of what one of the hill forts might have looked like, just so you can kind of visualize. It was characterized by the bank and ditch around the outside, but these will have been quite substantial ramparts with palisaded fences around the top. We've got lots of hut circles showing in the middle here, lots of little roundhouses. We don't really know, and we especially don't know about the hill forts in this region, in this particular area, how densely they were settled, whether they did have hill forts and actually an actual domestic occupation within them. But we are, as part of the project, going to be doing some geophysics at Bodbury Ring, which maybe will give us a bit of a clue as to what was in the interior, and hopefully we might find some evidence to suggest what was going on inside. And we have recently, as part of the our Upland Common project, done some geophysics at Nordy Bank, which is on Brown Clee Liberty Common, and we think we've picked up the trace of one roundhouse. and similarly, I think over at Nestcliff, they've picked up possibly one roundhouse. So we really don't know how, if this is what they looked like. And what's interesting about this image as well is you can see the landscape around has actually been portrayed as kind of divided up into field systems and field patterns and hedges. And I don't think there's much indication. We don't know what the landscape looked like in the stepping stones area really in this period. We do have evidence for some settlements, and I'm hoping I'll try and zoom in and have a look at some of them later on the LIDAR data. But particularly at Black Knoll, which is in the southern slopes of the Longmynd, we do have some evidence for Iron Age settlement and field systems, and evidence that they were carrying out agriculture in the area. And there were a few others as well at Leewood and Hordersley Farm scattered across the whole of the area, the stepping stones area. So we're starting to find out more. It's not such a blank as it is in the Bronze Age. We've got a little bit more evidence, but we still don't really know exactly, what would the view have been from the shop here in 800 BC. I don't know. I don't think it would have looked just like it does on this image here, particularly. This image actually just shows the distribution in yellow. So all these little yellow dots, this is the kind of data I've been sort of looking at and playing with and trying to understand what it means. This shows everything that I'm calling prehistoric, really. So anything that comes before the Roman period is marked by a little yellow dot here. And I think, you can see the patterns emerging, and it's all what I've just mentioned, really. It's clustering on the high ground. You've got this dense patch on the Longmynd, and then you've got a really dense area of settlement. There's diaper stones, and over at Stapley Common, with only the very few bits of activity. This is all the data that comes from the historic environment record that's held by the local authority, by Shropshire Council. So anything that they've recorded should be held on that database. So anything from that period should show up on there. And so I've just been using that to try and pick out where the significant areas are, and where the areas that we might, the areas of interest where there might be new evidence waiting to be discovered as well. So if we sort of whistle forward in time to the Roman period, it's quite interesting, really. I think in some regions you do see quite a lot of evidence of the hill forts from the Iron Age being reused in the Roman period, and you quite often get occupation or even evidence of sort of Roman attack and occupation of the hill forts. But there's nothing to suggest that at any of the sites within the area. There is a legend around Caradoc and the last stand of Caraticus, but I don't think there's not much evidence behind that being more than just a legend, really. And what we do have from the Roman period is mostly just focused in this sort of bottom end of the site here. Obviously, we've got Watling Street, which follows a line roughly similar to the A49 as it goes up north towards Wroxeter, and there has been excavations in the area across Watling Street, and the substantial sort of Roman road has been discovered. Then we've got a sort of focus on this area around Linley, and a Roman villa was identified at Linley Hall. And actually, I think I've got some images, and it actually comes from the article I quoted earlier, this 1856 article, which describes this visit from this chap to London to the Reverend Moore of Linley Hall, and how as they set off to try and have a look at the evidence of mining, the Roman mining at Shelve, and as they went past, they noticed some Roman remains, which he clarified as Roman, and they set the workmen to work to excavate the remains as they went off to spend the day at Shelve. And when they came back, the workmen had revealed this substantial Roman villa with its rooms and the hypocaust here, and this is the image that is shown in the article here. So that's over here, located where at Linley Hall is, and then we have got some evidence up here. It's called Linley Hall Camp, and it's a bit unclear what that feature is, but again, it's thought to date from the Roman period. So we do have this evidence of activity in the Roman period. The Romans were coming in. We don't know what they did to the landscape, whether there was any changes. I mean, I suspect that the rest of the landscape just carried on much as it was in the Iron Age, with people living perhaps in scattered farmsteads and still farming the land in the same way as they had done throughout the Iron Age. But what is really interesting is this evidence, this suggestion that the Romans were mining, which is the first evidence of mining taking place in the area. And you get this lovely description of, and I think it's back on here, and I particularly like the drawing of the ancient wooden spades, which they believed they'd found in the Roman mines at Shelve, and this Roman pig of lead with the Roman inscriptions on it, which was found in the mine at White Grit, suggesting that mining really did start as early as in the area, as early as the Roman period, which is in itself, really, really significant. And if we could actually find, I mean, we have these kind of sort of what's the word? Well, they date from 1856, so we don't know exactly where they came from, but we have these remains, and if they could be proven and we could see where they were from and we could date that, then Roman evidence of Roman mining is really significant and something quite exciting, really. And I think it's likely that, like I said earlier, the rest of the landscape was important in this period, and the Romans did place a lot of importance on the upland areas for animal products and minerals, and it's likely that they did use this landscape, but they haven't left much evidence, and the evidence is scant, and in general it's usually easier to spot than some of the earlier evidence. So I think it doesn't seem that likely that there are many Roman villas waiting to be discovered within the area. I'm going to whistle forward again from the Roman period, and I'm skipping really to the medieval period, which I'm sort of having as starting in 1066, but I'm missing out a huge chunk of time there. But what we don't have is a lot of evidence in any of the area really, which dates to the early medieval period, so that period which we used to call the Dark Ages, which after the Romans have left and before kind of Norman conquest, I suppose. And it's not unusual that we don't have a lot of evidence from many places, to be honest, for this time period. But it seems likely to me that there was quite a lot of activity going on in this landscape in the time period. You've got Offa's Dyke. I mean, it's 4 or 5 kilometres to the west. It's a substantial earthwork feature that really, it seems quite stark that there's no evidence of what was going on in the communities nearby. There was obviously enough manpower and enough significance to come along and construct this great monument. It seems really unusual that we should have such little evidence of what was going on. But I think in general, the landscape first starts to look like it does today in this time period, and divisions, the political divisions and boundaries start being set out in the early medieval period. And we can also pick up some hints of which settlements might be quite early. And I think we can look at place names, and it might not be a physical remain in the ground. We might not have evidence of activity, but if you look at evidence, for example, place names that end in the term cot, which is thought to date to the early sort of Saxon periods, and you've got Picklescott and Smethcote and Betchcote, perhaps these are all settlements that started life out in this period. But I'm going to start talking properly about the medieval period, because that's when really our evidence just starts to become a lot greater. We have a lot more evidence, we have written evidence, and it's a lot more easy to see in the landscape the traces of what was going on in the medieval period as well. So what I've done here is I've taken some data known as historic landscape characterisation data, which again is data that Shropshire County Council hold. And I've tried to sort of look at that data and see if I can work out what the landscape would have looked like during this time period and how that would have differed from today. So I think this area, as I've already alluded to, is it's an upland farming area. Commons played a really significant role in the landscape. They sort of dominated the landscape. They were very important, and locals and the villagers around will have all had grazing rights, much as they do today on the commons. But actually, these commons would have been much bigger than they are today. So this image on the left, this shows areas. It's not all common actually. Some of it is hill pasture and unimproved land, but you can see the areas that are highlighted in orange. It's just how the landscape looks today. Areas of open grazing essentially. And if you look at the image on the right, you can see the yellow shows areas that are likely to have been commons in the medieval periods. You can see how much more of the landscape will have been taken up with that land use. And they were really important parts of the landscape and were used by like I say, by locals and villagers for grazing, but also sort of big landowners would have kept, we know that the Earl of Arundel, for example, kept large numbers of sheep on the Long Mynd. So there was substantial kind of production going on, as well as this more small scale farming. And I think in the valleys and on the lower ground in the medieval period, we start to see evidence for agriculture and how the landscape was being used for farming. So you have the kind of upland grazing on the commons, and then the people living in the valleys were supported by subsistence farming. And you start to see this coming through in all the data that you look at. And you can see it just by looking as you walk around the landscape, really. So these again are images from the LiDAR data, and this one on the left shows the remnants of, it's a really beautiful image of medieval strip farm, remnants of medieval strip farming, which are sort of fossilized in the landscape near Wentner. So you can sort of imagine before they were enclosed, these were part of an open field farming system around the village, where everybody had their own strips of land to farm. And you can see the long, thin, really characteristic long, thin strips, which represent an individual's piece of land that they will have farmed. And again, you can see a similar thing on the right-hand side. You can see this ridge and furrow, we call it, which is what you can see left in the ground as the plough has gone up and down and created these ridges in the landscape. And these are images from the LiDAR data, which gives you an idea of what the ground surface looks like, so you can pick up undulations in the ground. And so it's a really good way of looking at the landscape. But the image at the bottom shows you can actually see it when you're out on the ground as well, very often. And that's a field on the slopes of Caradoc, where you can see it's a long, thin strip field, which has been enclosed at a later date and has the hedge running up the side, but you can still see the bank down the middle of the division between the strips were. And so I've put the numbers there. When I was doing this work, I was kind of crunching the numbers and working out how much of it all was. So we've got 135 records of ridge and furrow, most of which I think is probably medieval. You can see the medieval ridge and furrows, very characteristic of these images on the right, where you can see the quite wide strips and they're curving before the ploughing systems became much more mechanized. You can see this sort of broadly curving images. So we've got 135 records of those in the historic environment records. So it's a really important part of the nature of the landscape, really, this kind of evidence of past farming, which is really nice because it's just showing the sort of continuity of use, I suppose, through to today, really, where we're still using the landscape in the same sort of way. And this is a bit of a crazy slide to look at. I'm sorry, it's probably a bit hard to see on your screens, but this was my sort of attempt at trying to create what I think the landscape will have looked like in the medieval period. So you can see we've got the orange where the common land is, and the yellower areas, which was previous common land. And then I've got the dark green where we've got all these evidence of medieval strip farming. So all these areas around here, which is where we do have evidence in the landscape or in the field boundary patterns. But then I've also added this layer of areas that might not be wooded today, but we think were woodland in this period. So this sort of darker greeny grey colour shows the extent of how different the landscape would have looked, really. You've got much more open land and much more woodland, quite restricted areas, really, of farming. So I think, I know it's a bit hard to kind of take in, but it's quite an interesting idea to try and recreate what the landscape might have looked like in the period. Perhaps more kind of easier to kind of understand is this notion of, I'm just moving my can see all the people kind of, whereas I can't see my slides. Motte and Bailey castles. So 1066, after the Norman conquest, there was a period of sort of consolidation and defence almost, I think, as the area was sort of politically becoming more settled. And in this landscape, again, like the hill fort, seems to be an area where these features are really, really prevalent. So Shropshire as a whole, you know, there are over 88 earthen castles, and we've got 19 within the area of the stepping stone. So it's a really interesting and quite significant. So it's the sort of flip side of just how people were living. You've got this kind of idea of the Normans establishing control over the area and imposing defence, and so it's reflected in this sort of large number of sites. And I think, again, I'm not sure if you can see the image on the right. I can't even see it myself, so it's probably not very clear for you, but the little triangles show where some of these castles are located, these Motte and Bailey castles, all around the edge here of the Longmynd, and all around the bottom edge as well. So you can see just how important a feature of the area they are, really. Like I say, there are 19 within the area. I just put this slide in just to help us kind of visualize, is a kind of textbook image of what you might think a Motte and Bailey castle might be. But I think it's quite nice to use it to visualize, because actually they do just look like lumps and bumps in the ground at the moment. But if you can imagine them like this, kind of areas of quite substantial defence, then it gives it a different perception. If you think that there were such high numbers of them across the landscape, that the landscape must have been sort of kind of felt like a different place at the time. So this is what, this is an artist's reconstruction of what one might have looked like, with your classic motte and your mound here, you keep on the top, and then the Bailey or the outer earthworks at the bottom. And this is, again, this is a lovely image of this is one, Castle Pulverbach. And I think a lot of work has been done here, actually, as part of a previous landscape partnership project in the area. The Stagstones and Cordon Valley Landscape Project did quite a lot of work, so we've got quite a good understanding of activity at Castle Pulverbach. I thought I had a layout image of them, but I don't. But work has been carried out at a couple of these motte sites, and we've got activity from Smethcote. It has been dated to the 12th and 13th century, and at Woolston as well. So there are, again, we know a little bit more from this time period, and we could, if we wanted to, we could really sort of home in on these sites, find out a little bit more about them. Although, as a rule, they generally seem to fall out of use in the 13th century. There are a couple of instances where they're rebuilt in stone, but often these timber earthen castles seem to just fall out of use. I'm aware that I'm still in the medieval period. This is another map image, again, with me kind of trying to play around with the data and looking at where the settlements are and where we've got evidence of the settlements. So the purple little dots show settlements that date to before the 1880s, so earlier than the map, and many of them are much, much earlier as well, actually. I think most of them are probably medieval, and the settlement patterns stay the same. That big villages aren't common in this area, and there's lots and lots of sort of dispersed farmsteads, scattered hamlets and things. But interestingly, we do have evidence of shrunken or lost settlements as well, and you can't really see it very well on this image, and we might have to see if we can zoom in a bit on the LiDAR in a bit, but the yellow does show areas where there have been settlements previously, but they have been lost. We've got deserted medieval villages or settlements that have shrunk in size, although these ones up here on the Stagstones are a bit of an anomaly, because they are in general settlements that are related to a later period, the post-medieval period, and they are deserted mining settlements. So they really represent a sort of influx of people to work in the mines in the area. And then once the mines have gone out of use and that activity stops, those people have gone, and the evidence that they've left of the settlements in the area are really, really substantial and really quite visible in the landscape as well. I'm going to start whistling through some of this a little bit more. I'm kind of moving into the post-medieval period. We start to see, again, a focus on farming, and the commons still remain important in this period. And we start to see there's lots of nice, and I've not really been looking at the documentary evidence for this, just the physical evidence, but once at this stage you can start really delving into the historical documents. And there's all sorts of stories about commoners contesting their rights, different parishes and different groups losing their rights to gaze on commons, and you get riots in Church Stretton over grazing rights on the common and things. So it's a period of quite a lot of upheaval, really, and quite a lot of change. You see and it's the beginning of enclosure as well, and it's very much that story of enclosure really seems to dominate the landscape in this period, with the changes in ownership, changes in landlord arrangements, and land starts getting parcelled up or sold off, or big landowners coming in and sort of pushing the smaller ones out, and there's all kinds of changes. And that, what I find really fascinating is that's massively reflected in the field patterns, and you can see that just in the landscape. So you start to see these piecemeal enclosure, this is an aerial view of the image I showed before of Wentner, where you start to see these strips actually being enclosed as people, as owners, people starting to own their own fields and their own strips rather than using the open field system. So this kind of piecemeal enclosure, and I think it's highlighted in the dark red on that image in the past, so you can see that you get this early enclosure, these early changes in the landscape. They still sort of reflect these kind of sinuous patterns in the landscape, and they tend to follow the nature of the landscape. Whereas when you move into sort of later periods and you get these periods of planned enclosure, you can also see them really, really clearly in the landscape. And the image on the right, I think, is planned enclosure along Prollymore. Yeah, that's it. And it's really characteristic. You can see the edge of the moor, and you can see where these enclosure patterns have been imposed on the landscape. These really straight lines, really rigid field systems and things. And this comes in. I think there's not a lot of it actually in Shropshire, and it's not as common as it is in other parts of the country, where you get, in some parts of the country, you get these big kind of parliamentary acts of enclosure, and huge swathes of the land are enclosed. And you can see it's the dark pink on this image. You just get these snippets of it in the lower valleys, where these big fields are imposed on the landscape. And you also get these little patterns in the landscape of squatter enclosures as well. And this is where sort of smaller scale encroachment on the common land is taking place. So not these kind of big landlords planning large enclosure, it's people just eking away around the edges, nibbling away at the edges of the common and making their own enclosures. And this also contributes to the size of the commons being reduced. So when we saw in the medieval period the commons were much wider, there's a whole combination of factors that are reducing the size of the common, and that's this planned enclosure, but also just this piecemeal enclosure, this squatting enclosure. The earliest reference in the area, I think, dates from 1559, where there's a record of dwellings on the Lawley, which are believed to be those of kind of squatters or cottagers. And often, this is not, it doesn't sound, it makes it sound different to how our interpretation of squatting today as an illegal activity, but it was often encouraged by the lords of the manor as a way of them getting money, to be honest. And you see a lot of these, and this is a very characteristic one around Perkins Beach, this kind of linear squatter enclosure just on the edge of the common here. This image, I'm just going to kind of skip through a little bit, but you can see the purple dots here. There are 100, no, I've forgotten the numbers now, I didn't write them down. There are 402 historic farmsteads that have been mapped as part of a farmstead mapping project, actually, within the landscape. And I think these are historic farmsteads, but these really represent what the landscape, to me, looks like today. So there's a lot of scattered farmsteads within the lower valleys, and you get more dense areas of farmsteads, if you can see, around the edges of the commons and the areas of planned enclosure. So a lot of the farmsteads and the buildings relate to when the land was enclosed. And then I'm kind of rushing through, and honestly, so many of these time periods are so important and so significant, and we could talk at great length about all of them. There's so many sort of little individual stories you could tell around enclosure and different changes that are taking place in the landscape. And there's such a wealth of information in the documentary records as well that you could delve into. And I am literally just whistling through it all, because I'm trying to get through the whole of time, really, and bring us up to present day. But I think there's so many different things, and there's so many interesting little projects and little stories out there in the landscape, and a really hugely important part of the landscape of the area is this focus on industry and mining. It's a really major feature in the area, and it is of national significance. And it does focus in well, obviously where the resources that were being exploited are located, which is this area around the Stiper Stones. And you can see, I've marked it here on the map, in areas of black represents areas of mining. And you've got the lead mining that started at the bog in the 1970s, in the 1730s, and by the 1870s was one of the bog was producing one of the main sources of Britain's lead. It's such an important landscape, and I'm not gonna start talking about it now, because I don't really have time, and there's so much information out there, and there has been lots of work done already on that area of the landscape. And I just wanted to sort of flag it up as an important element of the landscape. And here are just some images of what that looks like in the land. So what it means is we end up with this kind of complex landscape with all sorts of different layers of history, from enclosure, from Bronze Age, right up to these remnants of industry, basically, and kind of bringing us almost right up to the modern day. And that's what you see when you walk around this landscape, and that's what people associate with the landscape. It's a really significant component of it for a number of reasons. I'm just bringing it up to a little bit more of the time, more to where we are today. These big upland common areas have been used for all sorts of things, recreation as well as grazing. And you see this huge activity on the Long Minns and on the Stiper Stones for grouse shooting, falconry, and even golf as well. So these big open areas start to become, as we move closer towards today, areas of recreation as well, bringing us almost up to where we are now. And this idea of using it for these huge swathes of land for shooting and falconry. And we see, and these activities bear, but the landscape bears the scars of these activities as well. So we get lots and lots of features related to shooting. This is the shooting box on the Long Mind, which is built right in the top of a Bronze Age barrow, but that's another story. And this is the type of evidence that you see on the Long Mind. Over on the Stiper Stones, the shooting butts look a bit different. They tend to be these sort of semicircular dry stone walls, again, just responding to the local geology. But again, everywhere we look, the elements of the land, the history of the land is visible within the landscape. And I'm sort of conscious of time, and I'm coming to the end, really. And I feel like I kind of haven't done justice to any of the time periods here, really. But I just wanted to quickly talk about Pole Cottage, because we are hopefully going to be doing a little bit of work, and this is going to be part of our Upland Common project, as opposed to the Stepping Stones project, but the two are so interlinked. And this is a building that was situated, and many of you probably know it, right on top of the Long Mynd. And this house was there until the 60s or 70s. And we think its origins, date back, well, really early. Hopefully, we think that there might have been buildings there in the medieval period, but we certainly know of it, and it was a gamekeeper's cottage, and that building was only knocked down in the 60s and 70s, and lots of people have memories of it, and the falconer lived there, and we have stories of the people that have lived and spent time in this cottage on the top of the Long Mynd, which is, and this map just shows it here, it's this sort of really nice little enclosure out of the common on the top of the Long Mynd. And we are trying to do some survey work and do some research into this particular building. So it's just really an example. I've gone really wide and looked at all these kind of, features right across the landscape. It's just an example of how we can then hone that right in and look at one particular element of the landscape. And we're going to try and look into it, do some research, and maybe do some excavation as well in the summer. So look out for that. Look out for information basically about that, because that is coming down the line over the next couple of months. Okay, I feel like I've talked for quite a long time, and there's a lot of blank screens, and people are probably falling to sleep because it's getting quite late, and I feel like it's quite late. Charlie, I don't know what you want to do. Do you want to maybe ask some questions, or shall I share a bit of the LiDAR data, or do you want to do some questions now to wake people up a bit?
Yeah, thanks, Janine. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure people aren't asleep because, it was just brilliant. I think being able to start to read the landscape from a historical point of view is, just a fascinating thing. I think because we have had some questions come into the chat, if I read out the questions in the chat, then I'll see if anyone's got their hand up wanting to ask a question. And then, depending on time and how you're feeling, we could look at some of the sort of live data. Obviously, people are free to leave whenever they want to. If people are tired and want to leave, that's absolutely fine. But we'll carry on for a bit longer if that's okay. So starting with the questions. So zooming back in time first to the sort of prehistoric stuff that we were talking about at the beginning. How do you date the cross dikes?
They've been carbon dated, actually. So they've been dated using radiocarbon dating techniques. So you have to sort of dig in and get undisturbed ground, basically, which hasn't seen the light since it was buried, basically. And then you send it off to clever people in the laboratory who date it using carbon dating techniques. They can be quite accurate. They don't give you an exact date, but they give you an idea.
Great, thanks to Alison for that. Renee makes an interesting point as well about the association with sort of historic features and the uplands. So she's saying perhaps it's the case that the large number of preserved barrows on the Mynd, on Stiperstones, on Stately, maybe they can be explained because they're on the commons and the unploughed soils of permanent pasture through long-term commoning practices have kind of safeguarded them. And she just finishes with the stat that 11% of all scheduled monuments are on common land. So is it, what's the cause and effect there of that association?
It's a really good point, and I usually mention it actually, and I haven't mentioned it tonight, but it is to do, things are preserved on the commons, and certain land uses are destructive of archaeology. So if you've got a barrow in a field which has been ploughed for centuries, then the chances are there's not much of the barrow left anymore. So commons are known, and heathland, they're special places because they haven't been as intensively managed perhaps as other elements of land, and you do get a greater preservation. Yeah, it's not just about them being features of uplands, really. There might well have been equal amounts of barrows in the lower lying areas, but activity since could have damaged them or caused. And actually, I did come across in that article that I was reading, someone in the 1856, he described travelling up around the bottom slopes of the Longmynd and viewing a barrow that had been cut through by workmen building a road. So it might well be that we have no idea that barrow isn't on my map now, and that we don't know anything about that anymore because it was destroyed, 200 years ago by somebody building a road, basically. So all this development basically is destructive of archaeological features, and René's quite right. Commons are really unique, special places because they preserve these features because of the way they're managed.
Thanks. So Rich is asking about the LiDAR data. So actually, just to add to his question, just could you quickly explain sort of what LiDAR is and how it works, what the resolution is? But Richard's specifically asking about whether it's affected by vegetation, so can it see through woodland differently to how it sees through moorland, or also ground conditions, so wet ground, dry ground, does that have an effect?
Shall I just try and share some? Because I think what I was going to just demonstrate some of the LiDAR data. So we've had some of the LiDAR images that I've used in the talk where LiDAR that was flown as part of the Stiper Stones and Cordon Valley project, and we have just had a new LiDAR survey commissioned for the rest of the Stepping Stones area, and I literally got it this afternoon. So I thought it'd be quite exciting to share some of it with you because it's really, really good. And actually, I can perhaps, let me just see if I can get it on. I can perhaps just talk through and we could look at different. So this is an area, if it's going to work. This is the new data, hot off the press. First time anyone's seen it, even me, really. I had about a 5-minute look at it before. This is the area around Black Knoll that I talked about, I think, and you can see these ridges and things. And I think if you look a bit further up here, that stippled effect, I think is bracken, actually. So the vegetation does affect it. So what it is, it's a light emitting radar. So a plane flies over and sends a laser down, it bounces back off the earth and it gives you an elevation model of the earth. So you get all the lumps and bumps are in the ground. They measure, I don't know the technical exactly technically, but it measures the time that it takes the laser to bump back down to the earth and come back up again, and creates these lumps and bumps. And what we're looking at here is an elevation model of the ground, essentially. And the reason I thought if I turn it on, you can, and it might not be relevant in this particular area, but the beauty of it is you can strip the trees out. So the trees do get in the way, but you can strip out the trees from the image and see what's in the ground. I'm trying to find a wooded area now to show you, but there you go. So you can see here this area of trees. So if you had an aerial photograph of this area, you wouldn't be able to see what was below these trees. But if I turn the tree layer off, you can see that we can see what's in the trees, and that gives us insight into the land that you can't get from anything else, because if you walk over that piece of land, the trees would stop you from viewing. So here you can see, I mean, it's probably trackways across through the woods that you can see, but you can see kind of a bank here as well. So that's the beauty of the LiDAR, is that kind of ability. It is affected by vegetation. So if the tree cover is too dense, you might not achieve such good resolution, but you can also take away the trees and see what's below it. So it is a really, really useful tool for archaeologists, but it's really useful for lots of other reasons as well. And so this is the data, and it's really high resolution. I think this is, I think it's 25 centimetre resolution. This, so some of the LiDAR, I think the Environment Agency LiDAR data that you see is 1 or 2 metre. So you can see, and that means the intervals that you get your returns from. So you can see less basically, and this is really high resolution. So it's really nice to I just got lost in it before I came to talk, just scrolling around. So I don't know if you want to ask me more questions, and I'll just scroll around.
Yeah, well, Darren was actually asking about where you started that LiDAR image down at Blacknall. He's saying, is there a henge monument shape visible in that image?
Circular feature, and I'm not sure what that is. Let me see if I can go back to it. And I know that there are lots of warrens around there. There's lots of rabbit warrens. So it might be something to do with that. I'm trying to find where it was again. But there's also lots of cultivation features, and that's where we think there is an Iron Age settlement as well. No, I can't find it again now, can I? Where are we? Down at Blacknall. There it was, wasn't it? This circular feature here, I mean, that's so clear, isn't it? It's amazing. I've only just looked at it, so I need to go away and look up exactly what these are. And there has been some survey work here, so it might be that I'll be able to tie that up with the details of the survey, but we can zoom right in on that as well. So you can see it's a bank, a circular bank. You can see the raised feature, and there's another little feature here. And you have to, it takes a while. This actually, now that's come clearer, this is a pond, and you can see that this is a water feature. It takes a while to kind of get your eye in and sort of start understanding what you're looking at, because some of the features can be modern features. And we have had a few instances of getting really excited about features we've spotted on the LiDAR. We had it at Croft Castle once when I thought I'd seen all these enclosures, and I went went out with the rangers to look at it, and they said, oh no, they're the dead hedges that we laid last year. I was like, right, okay, I thought they were prehistoric features. So you have to kind of you have to sort of learn to read and understand it. But this little snapshot here is amazing. There's all sorts of things going on there. We could spend hours looking at the archaeology in that little area. But yeah, sorry, are there more?
Well, René's just commented saying that they'll be holding a workshop on interpretation of the LiDAR data.
Absolutely, and we're hoping, as part of the Our Common Cause project, and possibly as part of Stepping Stones as well, that we're hoping to get volunteers involved in helping us look at this LiDAR data, because it's this huge area, and you can see the level of detail in some of it. There's absolutely masses there to pick out. So I think what we really want to do is try and get volunteers involved in helping us try and understand what some of those features are, but also getting out on the ground perhaps to have a look at them in order to check they're not dead hedges, or check they're not kind of modern features. So that is going to be a really good opportunity to look out for, certainly. And I think it's probably going to be around May time, perhaps, that we'll start looking at holding workshops and things around that. So
question from Marcus. I'd heard that in the Neolithic period, the lowlands were likely to have been heavily wooded, with hilltops much more open, like islands within the wooded landscape, giving rise to more human activity and associated landforms. Do you know if that's likely, Janine?
I think it's when we think that's when woodland clearance really first started in the Neolithic period. I think that yes, there was much more. I mean, we were able to recreate the picture of the medieval landscape, but it's much harder to kind of recreate the picture for the Neolithic landscape. But yes, it would have been much more heavily wooded. But I think you're quite right. Uplands like the Long Mynd, for example, and we have done some sort of pollen analysis work has been done there, and we do think that even as early as the Bronze Age, that was characterised largely by grassland, actually. So the hilltops were these kind of open grasslands, but the slopes, I think, would have been much more heavily wooded. In the Neolithic period, and even right up until the medieval period, really, you can see the woodland was a lot more prevalent.
So a couple of other comments on what some of those features might be, really. So Andrew's saying, is Blacknall where the golf course was? Could that
yes,
be?
there was a golf course. Yes, that could be. Yeah, circular.
That could be something to do with that.
It is a bit golf coursey. I'm sliding over to Caradoc here because I want to have a look.
Yeah, and Darren's saying would banjo enclosures? I'm not sure what a banjo enclosure is. Is that to do with the shape?
They're in the shape of a banjo, actually.
Right, okay.
So look for the kind of banjo shapes.
So Darren's saying, could that be to do with Mesolithic reindeer herding on the Mind?
Gosh, that's not one I've given any thought to be honest. I'll come back to you on that one, Darren. I've not come across any hint of reindeer herding in the Mesolithic. We don't know much about what was going on in the Mesolithic, to be honest, in the Longmen. So I'm open to any suggestions, really, to be honest. We could have a look into that.
So just another question from Alison, which actually I think Simon's answered, but Alison's saying, thinking about those squatter cottages and squatter enclosures, how would the lord of the manor get an income from that? And Simon said by charging rent, essentially. By
charging them, yeah, by charging rent, I suppose. Just letting them come and squat on his land and taking money from them. And it was all a big money making scheme, I think, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if people want, if anyone's got an area that they particularly want to have a look at on the LiDAR, just to end with, we could zoom in on one or two places.
If you want me to zoom in on anything, then let me know. I mean, we're hoping that we will try and share this LiDAR at some point, but it's a huge data set, so it's not going to be available as anything other than images in the near future. So yeah, if you want me to zoom in and show you anything right now, I'm looking
There's
at this.
A couple of suggestions in the chat box we can have a look at.
Sorry, what were the suggestions? I can't see them.
No, we haven't got any yet. I was just saying, people have a couple.
Well, I'm interested in in what I can see on the top of Caradoc here. I think it's amazing, and you can see the breaks in the ramparts as well of the hill fort. And what's really clear is that look at this pathway up the side as well. You can kind of see how it connects in with a break in the ramparts as well.
And could the LiDAR be used to do condition assessments, so to identify areas where erosion specifically is causing a problem for these features?
Yeah, I think it could be. I think we struggle with resolution. We've struggled with resolution in the past of LiDAR, but this data seems very, and literally is my first look at it, but it does seem like it's clear enough to pick out breaks and marks in the ramparts and things. So if some repair work gets done at Caradoc, which they are hoping to do, we might be able to look. If you flew it again in a couple of years, then maybe some of that would show up on it. Yeah, for sure.
Well, Paul's just asking, how was the LiDAR captured? It was an aircraft, wasn't it? I think, Janine.
It was an aircraft, which flies over, sort of makes passes forwards and back in a sort of low flying plane. Let's see if we can move over to anywhere else that we recognise. This is Bodbury. We looked at that before, didn't we? Takes a while. But yeah, if there's no more questions, then Charlie, then I think that's probably a good enough time.
I'll just double check no one's got their hand up.
Let everyone, oh, there you go. It's just, you can see resolution at Bodbury. This is the golf course as well. So the golf course does show up, although much clearer here. You can see the golf course here overlying the kind of ridge and furrow and the earlier features underneath.
Oh yeah.
The golf, I assume these are golf course features on top here. This is the golf course up by Bodbury Ring.
And I guess that underlines the importance of getting some ground truthing,
so you're not assuming
a date on some of these features.
I know there's a golf course here, so I think they're not round barrows, but you might mistake them for round barrows if you didn't know. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I would say really look out. If people are interested, there's lots of things coming up. I haven't got a list of dates and things, but I think that keep your eyes peeled, and we will be sharing. Bodbury, actually, we are going to be doing some geophysics that is going to take place on the 10th of March. I think I'm right. Renee might correct me in the chat if I'm wrong. And people will be able to walk up and watch that happening if they're interested. You know, that will be, there will be a little talk by the chap carrying out the geophysics on that day. So yeah, we'll put out some information about that so people keep their eyes peeled. And again, there's going to be work looking at this data coming up, looking at the LiDAR data, and hopefully work at Cottage coming up in the summer as well. So yeah, lots of stuff going on around the historic environment and the stepping stones.
Well, I think what I'll do is send a follow-up email to everybody on this call. We'll include a link to the recording of the talk so people can watch again or you know, repeat certain bits if they're particularly interested in something. But in that email, I'll also include details of those events and those potential volunteering opportunities, or point people towards where they can find that extra information. So yeah, look out for an email in the next few days. Okay, so yeah, it just leaves me to say a huge thank you to Janine for putting that talk together. Yeah, it was just, like I said, absolutely fascinating. So I really appreciate that, Janine. And thank you to everybody who's come along and watched it tonight. It was great to have so many people, and I think just shows how many people are interested in the area, well, all aspects of the area, you know, from wildlife and conservation right through to the historic environment. Okay, so yeah, I think we'll call it a day. So yeah, thanks again, Janine, and nice to see everybody.
Brilliant. Thanks everyone for coming along. Thank you. Great to see you all.
Bye.